All right, today we're diving deep into one of the most debated topics in high-end audio, solid-state versus tube preamps. Why do people swear by one or the other? What's actually happening under the hood that makes them sound different? And here's the big question, is tube warmth just distortion, or is there more to it? Before I get into it, I really want your comments on this subject, so please chime in with your experiences in the comments below. Let me know whether you prefer tubes or a solid-state preamp, and why. So a preamp, other than being a simple source selector, takes the low-level signal from your source and amplifies it to a level where your power amp can use it. Now on paper, a preamp should be completely neutral. It should just make things louder without changing the sound. Some refer to this conceptually as being a straight wire with gain. A straight wire with gain refers to an ideal preamp or amplifier that amplifies a signal without adding any coloration, distortion, or alteration, essentially behaving like a perfectly transparent wire that simply makes the signal louder. But we know that's not the case. Some preamps sound analytical, some sound rich, some seem to disappear altogether, and others leave a signature all over the music. And that brings us to the core debate. Solid state versus tubes. Why do people use tube gear? Audiophiles love tubes. We talk about the liquidity, the organic mid-range, the sound stage, the euphony, and that classic holographic presentation. But let's be real, tubes are inherently impractical. They run hot. They require higher maintenance, and they need periodic replacement because they're consumable components. So if people are willing to deal with all of that, there must be some clear advantages over solid state, right? But here's the thing, technically speaking, none of this should be happening. A tube preamp introduces measurable distortion. It alters the frequency response in subtle ways. It rolls off high frequencies at the extremes. It softens transients. And it compresses dynamics ever so slightly. Yet to many ears, that's exactly what makes it sound more real. Why? Because tubes distort in a way that's musically pleasing. Is tube warmth just distortion? All right, let's talk distortion. Every amplifier, every preamp, every piece of audio gear has some level of distortion. The difference is how they distort. Solid-state gear tends to produce odd-order harmonic distortion. This means when it starts to clip or add harmonics, it does so in a way that can sound harsh or unnatural to the human ear. The upper harmonics don't always complement the fundamental tone. They can create a sense of sharpness, of excess detail, sometimes even a brittle character. That's why some solid-state gear is described as dry, cold, or clinical. Tubes, on the other hand, primarily introduce even-order harmonic distortion. These harmonics are integer multiples of the original frequency, which means they tend to blend more smoothly with the original note. Instead of a harsh edge, you get a rounded, fuller presentation. Instruments take on a natural bloom, vocals gain a slight richness, and the whole presentation sounds, well, more like music and less like a lab experiment. But here's the part that really confuses people. Distortion in solid state is seen as a flaw, while distortion in tubes is often described as musicality. Why is that? How can distortion be audiophile quality? Because it's not just distortion, it's the way the human ear perceives sound. A completely neutral signal is not necessarily the most engaging. Think about how live music sounds. There's natural reverberation. There's a fullness that doesn't come from absolute clarity, but from the way tones interact in a space. Tubes, in a way, mimic that. They subtly enhance lower order harmonics, which creates the illusion of depth and presence. Now, is that true to the recording? Maybe not. But is it subjectively better? To many listeners, absolutely. What about soundstage and the holographic effect? Now let's talk about holographic imaging. This is one of the biggest reasons people love tube preamps. There's this perception that tube gear throws a wider, deeper sound stage, that instruments feel more separated, more three-dimensional. But why? A lot of it comes down to how tubes handle phase and harmonic structure. Tube circuits tend to introduce microsecond-level phase shifts, particularly in the high frequencies. This isn't something you can easily measure in traditional frequency response graphs, but the human brain is remarkably good at detecting it. These tiny phase shifts can create the sensation of a more spacious, airy presentation. Now, solid-state gear, especially fully differential balanced designs, tends to have much lower phase shift and tighter control over transients. That means sharper, pinpoint imaging, but sometimes at the cost of depth and organic realism. So, again, it's a trade-off. There's also another factor at play: output impedance. Vacuum tube preamps tend to have higher output impedance, which interacts with power amps in ways that aren't always linear. Depending on the amp's input impedance, you might get subtle shifts in frequency response that affect perceived width and depth. So which one is better? That's the big question, right? The truth is there's no right answer. Some listeners love the precision and transparency of solid state. Others prefer the warmth and depth of tubes. And then you have hybrid designs, preamps that use tubes in the gain stage, but solid state buffers for output, trying to capture the best of both worlds. Or even passive preamps, which are neither solid state nor tubes, just essentially a high quality volume control without active amplification, aiming for the purest, most transparent signal path possible. If you're the kind of person who wants to hear every last micro detail, every bit of texture in a recording, you might prefer a high-end solid-state preamp. If you want a more immersive organic experience, tubes might be the way to go. And then there's the final wildcard: system synergy. A bright system can benefit from tubes to tame the top end. A darker system might need a fast, neutral preamp to bring out detail. That's why the best advice isn't tubes are better or solid state is better. It's what works best in your setup, with your ears, with your preferences. Audiophiles can get a little agitated when they don't hear the differences that others swear by, and it's easy to assume it's all snake oil, someone's overactive imagination, or just some bloke in a forum talking nonsense. But here's the thing: the more resolving your system is, the more these differences become apparent. When you're swapping out components, cables, isolation devices, or even preamps, those subtle changes become more apparent in a resolving and revealing system. There's a trend among modern tube amp manufacturers to voice their gear as neutral as possible, almost like solid state. And that's fine, if that's what you want. But to me, it seems a bit counterintuitive. If a piece of gear has a sonic virtue that people find pleasing, why strip that away? Why take something inherently euphonic and try to disguise it as neutral? I've owned a lot of preamps and line stages over the years. Somewhere around 80% of them have been vacuum tube designs. I've had Conrad Johnson preamps that sit at the warmer and darker end of the euphony scale. And I've had preamps from companies like Audio Research that leaned far more neutral and analytical. On the solid state side, I've owned preamps from Linn, Krell, Electrocompaniet, and a handful of others, and while some were excellent, I can't deny where my preferences lie. I'm unapologetically a tube guy at heart. Here's a quick look at the Donsax Model 2 that's in and out of my system presently. It's a nice 6SN7 based line stage, and there's a full review of this thing on my blog at audioresurgence.com. Under the rack, there's a VTL preamp that needs retubing, and off to the side, a nice little Backert Labs preamp that I plan to send back to the manufacturers for a tune-up. You can see that running tube gear takes a commitment not just in cost but in space too. I have a few different storage areas around the house that I use for hiding my stash. So here's my take. If you love tubes, don't let anyone tell you you're just listening to distortion. It's more than that. It's about harmonic structure, phase response, and how the human brain perceives sound. If you love solid state, don't feel like you're missing out on warmth. There are some incredibly natural sounding solid state designs out there. But at the same time, accept that you can't have it both ways. You can't expect a solid state preamp to suddenly give you the bloom and liquidity of tubes, just like you can't expect a tube preamp to match the grip and precision of the best solid state. At the end of the day, it's about the music. Not the measurements, not the graphs, not the endless debates. Just the experience of being transported by sound. And whichever path gets you there, that's the right one. Thanks for watching. If you want more of this stuff, please hit the like and subscribe buttons and turn on notifications. And please drop a comment below. If you think I'm talking nonsense, go ahead and share this with your community and let's see what they think. Cheers.